Well, it's about time we tackle a review that I've been waiting to get locked and loaded into, so grab your underpants and throw them away. It's time to go Commando for our next game. So what's my history with Ratchet & Clank 2 Going Commando, or Locked and Loaded in PAL regions, because you in PAL regions don't get the naughty references that we get in the North American region, I guess. Ratchet & Clank 2 Going Commando was one of the first PS2 games that ever really caught my eye and was on my radar before I ever got my PlayStation 2. This game I played at a friend's house, like most games I ended up playing during the early 2000s. This game was very interesting in its ad campaign that I would see frequently, something that would continue in Ratchet & Clank's history with Ratchet & Clank 3 Up Your Arsenal, where it would be a group of kids testing out the weapons that were inside of the game on random people or household objects. And it was an interesting ad campaign that I'd say did the job quite well. The whole point of Ratchet & Clank, based because of this game, would be because of the over-the-top weaponry that this game would introduce to the series. And having the ads showcase some of the more outlandish weapons, such as the Sheepinator, the lava gun, the atomic bomb that is the nitro launcher, and many of the other weapons, really were interesting to see in a young teen's mind. And it would be that this would actually be the first of the PlayStation 2 games I would own when I got my PlayStation 2 in 2005. The second game that same day being Kingdom Hearts 1 as well. Now, what's the development history of Ratchet & Clank 2 Going Commando? Well, Ratchet & Clank 2 Going Commando would start immediately after the production of Ratchet & Clank had finished, and Sony knew that they had a good franchise on their hands, and I think part of that is because of the faith they had in Insomniac Games being able to deliver very good games when they worked under Universal Interactive with the Spyro the Dragon series. Ratchet & Clank 2 Going Commando would release 1 year after Ratchet & Clank 1 would release, and would earn many sales that would allow it to become a greatest hits for the PlayStation 2. Now, that's not all that Ratchet & Clank 2 managed to accomplish. Ratchet & Clank 2, I say, is probably the most genre-defining game for the Ratchet & Clank series. Not simply because of its story, but because of all the gameplay mechanics that were added in and tweaked from the first Ratchet & Clank game. If it weren't for Ratchet & Clank 2 running as well as it did after Ratchet & Clank began to walk, I would say that the series would be very different if it would have continued were it not for Ratchet & Clank 2. So, unlike most times where I just talk about the story first, we're going to talk about the gameplay additions to Ratchet & Clank 2 first. Because, let me just say, when I mention that it's a genre-defining game, I mean it. Okay, so where to begin with Ratchet & Clank 2 gameplay tweaks? I guess the best place to start is what was carried over from the first Ratchet & Clank game. What worked in that game that would be elevated in this game? And I guess the first thing to start with is the movement. In Ratchet & Clank 1, the run and gun gameplay was very rudimentary, and oftentimes dodging attacks was a little bit more difficult and cumbersome than what was probably intended. Thus, in Ratchet & Clank 2 Going Commando, a new type of movement option was added when you hold the R2 or L2 buttons, and that is the strafe mechanic. Holding these buttons, you can strafe back and forth between the left and right by holding the left analog stick in those directions. But, not only that, if you hit the jump button while holding strafe and going left and right, you will do a flip which can jump over enemy attacks or allow you to jump over attacks much easier. This simple gameplay tweak to the movement changes the game dramatically, to the point where many people who start with Ratchet & Clank 2 and beyond when going back to Ratchet & Clank 1, can feel just how much the game has improved once they added the strafing mechanic. It is such a simple change that I cannot overstate just how well it works in the series. And honestly, the only thing since then that has made it better, I would say, came recently in Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart with the phase sort of dodge mechanic that you can hit with the circle button. Movement in Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart feels so fluid, and part of that is because the strafe mechanic was refined starting with Ratchet & Clank 2 onwards. Now, we also have an important addition in the form of the health. In the original Ratchet & Clank game, Ratchet had 4 hit points, which could be increased to 8 by drinking the nanotech boost that cost an arm and a leg in the first game. Now, in this game, it's handled a bit differently in that every time you kill an enemy, you gain experience, and that experience is represented in a bar that is right below where the health is displayed, which the health is displayed in a weird little hexagon nut. Every time you end up increasing in a level, your nanotech bursts and you do a screen nuke that can kill all enemies on screen that are present near you at the time. Now, that not only refills your health and increases it to a maximum of, I believe it's 100 hit points total, it does look a little bit cumbersome and would be refined in later Ratchet & Clank games to just being a solid number to keep track of rather than having to count each of the hexagon symbols. But if I'm being quite honest, I actually preferred the hexagon symbols because, I don't know, it added to the little bit of charm that the UI has in Ratchet & Clank going Commando onward. Now, not only do Ratchet and Clank gain experience and health points by defeating enemies, weapons also gain experience each time they are used and get a kill. With this, you're able to upgrade your weaponry to a new version of a weapon after fully maxing out the bar on that weapon. That is probably the most defining aspect of the old Ratchet & Clank games, and it didn't even start in the original Ratchet & Clank. It started in Ratchet & Clank 2. With weapon upgrades, you get not only a more powerful weapon after fully upgrading and using it for a while, oftentimes you also can get different modifications added to these weapons to make them more deadly or do damage over time, such as an acid or a shock mod by using the new titanium bolts. Or is it platinum? I tend to forget between Ratchet & Clank 2 and 3. I believe it's platinum bolts and then titanium is in the next game, but I could be wrong. I'll probably put a note on screen if I'm wrong. But with these weapon upgrades, most weapons gain new versatility early on in the game, but it comes at a cost for later gameplay, in that some early game weapons don't necessarily upgrade to a higher threshold that can be viable throughout the game. That's something that Ratchet & Clank, with this new gameplay addition, suffers from not only in this game, but going through the rest of the series, if I'm being quite honest. You can have favorites in the early game that fall off midway through the game, or even in Ratchet & Clank 2, as early as the 3rd level, some of the weapons just lose their versatility and aren't really viable to be used when you have new weapons to play with. Now, the weaponry in Ratchet & Clank 2 Going Commando is definitely an upgrade from the original Ratchet & Clank game. Because in the original Ratchet & Clank game, you had simple weapons such as a gun, a missile launcher, a guided missile launcher, things such as that. In Ratchet & Clank 2 Going Commando, you're limited by your imagination with some of these weapons. As mentioned beforehand, we have the trusty Sheepinator, which transforms enemies into sheep and upon upgrade turns them into black sheep that explode. You have the mini turret gun that allows you to launch out miniature turrets that shoot lasers at you, and upon upgrade will shoot mini rockets at enemies, with multiple ones being able to be placed on the field at the same time and eventually detonate after being used and running out of ammo. You have a mini turret gun that has a spider bot in it that is only honestly really useful for getting a couple of the hidden bolt collectibles, but upon upgrading does get a specialized cannon on the back that can be used to take out enemies from afar. You also have probably my favorite weapon in this game, the Bouncer. And the Bouncer is a series iconic staple, also appearing in games as late as Rift Apart, with you launching out a giant bomb that explodes into many miniature bombs. Needless to say, Ratchet Clank 2 really focused on the absurdity of the weapons in the game, and that's to your benefit because you'll find a favorite, sure enough, and they are kind of pricey. The economy in this game has been inflated quite a bit, but also getting bolts is much easier in Ratchet Clank 2, and the series in general, it's easier to get more bolts than it was in Ratchet Clank 1. Part of that is probably due to Megacorp having a literal monopoly on everything in the galaxy of Bogon, but that's beside the point. Now, we also have the new addition of armors in the game. Not only does Ratchet have lots of health he can gain by leveling up or finding hidden nanotech boosts in stages, but also we have the new armor system added in for this game, and something that would also continue into later Ratchet Clank games. For a simple set of bolts, you can get armor that can reduce your damage taken by 10%, 25%, 50%, 75%, nothing 100%, but one of the downsides of this is when you use this armor, you can't actually change it to anything else later in the game. Now, while the series would continue with the armor upgrades, it really wouldn't be until Ratchet and Clank Future, A Crack in Time, that the cutscenes kind of do get affected by these armor upgrades. When you get the strongest armor in the game, you lose the ability to see Ratchet emoting in cutscenes, which, unless you're using one of the skins that you can unlock by getting the returning skill points, it's kind of a shame. And another thing that returns is challenge mode, and based on what armor you finish the game with is what determines how your base armor is for your next challenge mode playthrough. So if you have the strongest armor in the game, you will end up having that armor be treated as the default starting armor when you start challenge mode. So in your old playthrough, you were unstoppable. You had 75% damage reduction. Well, guess what? That new 75% damage reduction is now 0%, and there is no upgrades in challenge mode for armor. It's something that Ratchet & Clank 3 and Deadlocked would have an issue with, and actually, now that I think about it, Future Tools of Destruction and A Crack in Time, it really wouldn't be, I think, until they kind of got rid of the armors for a bit in Ratchet & Clank All for One and Full Frontal Assault, that wasn't actually necessary. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Now, not only do we have main gameplay tweaks, but we also have many different types of mini-games added into Ratchet & Clank 2 Going Commando. So first we have the ship battles, which I personally liked in Ratchet & Clank 2. It helped the universe feel much more engaging, but this is something that would be dropped as early as Ratchet & Clank 3, where ship battles, there were only a few in Ratchet & Clank 1, and just like in Ratchet & Clank 2, there are a few, but they're more fleshed out as being levels all their own with different challenges that you can do for different amounts of bolts if you so wish. Now, you also have the hoverboard racing, which is only available on 2 worlds, Barlow and I forget the other one. I want to say it begins with a J, but it's another Megacorp game one, which these ones allow you to race different NPCs with a destruction derby sort of setting in order to get more bolts. No real purpose in playing this except for story mode and bolts. There is, I believe, a skill point or two attached to each of these, and in the Barlow one, there is a hidden bolt collectible in the actual racetrack. But other than that, this is something else that would be dropped from the Ratchet & Clank series, although in Ratchet & Clank 3 there was a race minigame mode planned. I'll get more into that later when we get to the Ratchet & Clank 3 review in about 10 years. Finally, we have Arena Combat. So Arena Combat was first added into Ratchet & Clank 2 with the Maktar Resort games and the Megacorp games. These two have many different challenges that you can use to unlock different story progressive items. For Maktar, it is the Electrolyzer, and for the Megacorp games, it is the Infiltrator, two other minigame hacking devices that the series kind of didn't need to have two of, but hey, why not? And then we have many different challenges, and honestly, the gameplay mechanic of the Arena Combat works very well. I mean, heck, they made a whole game based around this with Ratchet and Deadlocked, so if it didn't work, then that would have been kind of awkward, wouldn't it? So overall, Ratchet & Clank 2, in a gameplay standpoint, is very stacked. Add in bosses on certain levels that unfortunately can't be replayed, but that's kind of a series staple at this point. And you have a good gameplay tweak for things that would become mainstays for this series going forward. But what's the whole point of going through this game, and what are Ratchet & Clank up to in the new Bogon Galaxy after they defeated Supreme Executive Chairman Drek in the last game? Well, why don't we get into that right now real quick. So, what has happened in the months following the defeat of Supreme Executive Chairman Drek and the saving of the Solana Galaxy? Well, Ratchet & Clank find themselves in an interview at the beginning of the game, asking them about said adventures, and to be quite honest, it's kind of died down. Looks like the news cycle of, saving an entire universe doesn't really get you your 15 minutes of fame anymore. But during this interview, Ratchet and Clank are heralded to the Bogon Galaxy at the behest of the Megacorp president, Abercrombie Fizzwidget. You see, Abercrombie Fizzwidget has lost an experimental bio-pet that he wishes to sell in the Bogon Galaxy to a duplicitous thief of ill repent. So, he charges Ratchet and Clank with the task of being able to find them. Well, mainly just Ratchet. Clank is offered an accountant job at Megacorp and a free apartment, so hey, beggars can't be choosers, right? But throughout the adventure, as Ratchet and later on Clank, after he gets ensnared in the thief's plans, try to track down what is known as the Protopet, things start to kind of unravel, and not everything begins to seem like what it is meant to be. You see, the thief, it turns out, is a former Megacorp employee named Angela Cross, who looks surprisingly like a Lombax. Don't worry, the whole franchise gets kind of wild with her being a Lombax or not, so we'll just call her a Lombax in this case. And it turns out she was in Megacorp for trying to fix the Protopet's flaws, which it turns out this pet is actually quite dangerous. Think gremlins, but you don't have to feed them after midnight for them to be nasty. And so, halfway through the game, it becomes a race to try and stop the Protopet from being mass-produced and causing terror across the Bogon Galaxy. And that is the main premise of the plot for Ratchet & Clank 2. Obviously, there's twists and turns. There is also hints at who the main villain is if you pay attention to certain cutscenes throughout the game that play in certain key moments. I will say that Ratchet & Clank 2's story is kind of a step down, in my opinion, from Ratchet and Clank 1 story. While Supreme Executive Chairman Drek felt threatening and was very present in the story with all the actions he would do on each of the worlds, the main threat of the Protopet isn't really that much, and the mastermind behind it all proving to be Captain Quark, who wants revenge on Ratchet and Clank for ruining his life in the Solana Galaxy by having himself pose as a hero in a new galaxy with a new fan base, it doesn't really hit as well as Chairman Drek did, if I'm being quite honest. But luckily the next game saves up for a villain that kind of gets overused in the series. Maybe having unique villains isn't something that Ratchet and Clank is really known for, but I will say the story does get a pass and does have its humorous moments. I know for myself, I get a chuckle every time I see the Protopet launch trailer, where he pretty much, the Protopet just decides, I'm gonna go feral on this child, and I get a laugh out of that cutscene every single time. Sorry, Billy, your pain is my amusement. But I will say that Ratchet & Clank 2's story is very much more hidden in the details in the background. Now, we were introduced to Gadgetron in the first game, and Gadgetron does still exist in Ratchet & Clank 2. But we find out that they haven't operated in the Bogon Galaxy in years, to the point to where their main headquarters on planet Barlow is completely ransacked and run around with different tribal folk and a few nasty critters here and there. And that's when you find out that Megacorp has, well, a monopoly on the entire galaxy. See, while Ratchet & Clank 1 had its main theme of capitalism go, with how Chairman Drek just wanted everything for money, and that's how he was the one who polluted the world. In this game, it's a little bit more subtle with how it handles it, with inflation being how crazy the prices get for different weapons and armors, and even ship parts, with the once incredibly elusive material Raritanium being a basic currency for ship upgrades. In this game, bolts and Raritanium are just used as regular currency in the hundreds of thousands in usage. And I just find that kind of funny. It's really what happens when monopolies take over and only one person, place, and corporation controls everything in that universe, be it products, ships, and ways of travel. Even food and grocery stores are controlled by Megacorp, which the name for Megacorp kind of not really subtle, but hey, it works in the end of all this. It does also turn out that Abercrombie Fizzwidget, the one who Quark was pretending to be, is actually a nice guy who's really smart, and the reason why Abercrombie Fizzwidget sounds so babbling and dumb is because Quark is too dumb to be able to say any of the words that Abercrombie Fizzwidget is actually able to say. But I will say the story, while not the best in the Ratchet & Clank series, is passable, and like I said, it gets a good chuckle out of me. And that's where I think the voice cast really carries a lot of what is good in Ratchet & Clank 2, because they are just able to deliver such amazing performances that get the laughs out of me. So why don't we get into the big elephant in the room, and that is Ratchet's voice change. So in Ratchet & Clank 1, Mikey Kelly voiced Ratchet, and it was a decent performance. I don't mind Mikey Kelly's performance for Ratchet, but I will say that the new series staple voice actor for the game, James Arnold Taylor, was an amazing choice to choose for going forward. See, the cast needed to, and Insomniac in particular, wanted to tone down the jerkishness that was the Ratchet 1 Ratchet, and they felt giving him a new voice was the best way to do that. And I will say it does work in their favor. And James Arnold Taylor would go on and continue to voice Ratchet for everything in the series going forward, except in the original series for the falling screen. That's still Mikey Kelly all the way until Ratchet Deadlocked. Next we have Clank, who's gonna still be voiced by David Kaye. David Kaye does a really good job of making Clank sound more relatable in this version of Ratchet and Clank. In the first game, he was very, naive and calculated. In this one, he shows more emotion. In fact, some of that aggression that Ratchet has is now in Clank. And I think it really plays off rather well. And it's something the dynamic between James Arnold Taylor's Ratchet and David Kaye's Clank really bounce off each other as the series progresses to what you can feel is like a real actual budding friendship. Next, we have Captain Quark with returning voice actor Jim Ward, who unfortunately recently passed away. And Rift Apart is actually the first game that has a different voice actor for Quark, but Jim Ward does a stellar performance. Even though Quark being a villain doesn't work as well, he's better for comedy, which is pretty good. The Thief starts out being voiced by Roger Bumpus, best known for probably his Squidward Tentacles voice. You can actually hear that in some of the screams that the Thief does during the game. But after the Thief gets revealed to be named Angela Cross, she is voiced by Kath Suis. And yeah, the only real other ones that are big voice actors, I would say in this one, would honestly be probably Stuart Zergo, who, if you've played the series, you know who that character is. He is a Quark fanboy who can be entirely missed in this game. He is voiced by Benjamin Diskin. Yes, if you know Kingdom Hearts, you know who Benjamin Diskin is. He started as a Quark fanboy in this game decade before he became young Xehanort in Kingdom Hearts Dream Drop Distance and Kingdom Hearts 3. We also have the Water Worker, otherwise known as the Plumber, being voiced by Neil Flynn, returning again. And those are the main actors. A lot of the voices are recycled, but there is one other protagonist in the game, the Thugs for Less leader, being voiced by Steve Bloom, for example. Being a major role in this game for just being a main antagonist up until a certain point when it becomes clear, okay, we need to take out the Proto-Pet Menace. Everyone else in the game is generally voiced by smaller voice actors and actresses and don't have too many lines in the game, but I will say that the voice cast does an amazing job at bringing this game to life. It's something I love so much for Ratchet & Clank 2. Looking at you, Billy. Your pain is my amusement, and Chad Michael Enbinder does a good job at doing that. But not only that, we have the returning David Bergeaud for our music in this game. And while Ratchet & Clank 1 had a few tracks that really stood out, I would say David Bergeaud's tracks in Ratchet & Clank 2 are things I listen to on repeat repeatedly. My favorite track in this game will always be the Silver City Planet Bolden theme. That is just such a good track. Another one that's really good is the Tabora mining site, where you go and collect the crystals. I don't think it's as iconic as Kirwan Metropolis from Ratchet & Clank 1 and what it's also going to be in Ratchet & Clank 3. But David Bergeaud's music is just so good. I really wish the franchise would return to this style of music, because starting with Ratchet & Clank Future, A Crack in Time, they went for a more bombastic theater sounding track, and while it's good, David Bergeaud's style of music just holds up so much better for me. So, enjoy him while we still have him. He stops doing the music for this series after Ratchet & Clank Quest for Booty on the PlayStation 3. But overall, the voice performance and the music for Ratchet & Clank Going Commando is just phenomenal. And it's something that I recommend listening to without, having to run and jump around and focus on not die. I will say that Ratchet & Clank 2 is definitely a well-rounded game overall. While I find that the simplest aspect of this game is its story, it's brought up by its sound design and stellar gameplay enhancements from the original Ratchet & Clank, to where I honestly find myself coming back to Ratchet & Clank 2 way more often than I find myself coming back to Ratchet & Clank 1. Ratchet & Clank 1 did a good job at establishing the series and establishing the characters a little bit, while Ratchet & Clank 2 took all those gameplay ideas and tweaked them to a better version. Ratchet & Clank 2 is what I would consider to be a near perfect sequel. There are a few hiccups here and there. Some of the boss fights, such as the one against the thug leader at the near end of the game, are definitely low points in the game. But for a package overall together, Ratchet & Clank 2 Going Commando is definitely a game that you should try. If you've never played a PlayStation 2 Ratchet game, this is probably the one I recommend starting with more than any other one. Ratchet & Clank 3 adds a lot of gameplay tweaks too, but most of the genre-defining things that were added to this franchise started in this game, so I think it's probably a good idea to start with this one. Now, where does this leave us for people that want to play Ratchet & Clank 2 nowadays? Well, oddly enough, this game hasn't been ported to anything besides the PlayStation 3. There was, for the 10th anniversary by Idle Minds, a Ratchet & Clank collection that was released for the PlayStation 3. And the only way you can play that without having to do a streaming service, which, might I remind you, is internet-based and generally stinks for cloud versions, is to have the PS3 copy or the PS2 original. My hope is one day that this game will get ported to the PlayStation 5 via the PlayStation Classics line, similar to what happened to the Sly Cooper series for Sly's 1, 2, and 3. Or, even better would be a native PC port like the Jak Daxter series has gotten with the Open Gall project for the Jak 1, 2, and 3 games. I mean, Jak Daxter uses the same engine as Ratchet & Clank, only modified, and those games wouldn't exist were it not for Insomniac Games, so come on, please, I would love it. I guess you could also play on PCSX too, but there is some still lighting issues with the game, and that's about it, really. It's a shame that such a very well-loved game and a staple in what made Ratchet & Clank as popular as it was still can only really be played on two systems, being the monolith that is the PS2 and the overheating bread box that is the PlayStation 3. But anyway, everyone, I'm gonna end it off right here. This has been Neronium, and don't worry, I'll try to do the Ratchet & Clank 3 Up Your Arsenal review sometime within the next decade. But I'll see you all next time.